Tonight, we journey into a night when one of America's warmest, widest states was suddenly swallowed by a cold so deep it stunned the world. The Texas deep freeze, the 2021 winter collapse that left millions in the dark, is a story of frozen streets, silent homes, quiet courage, and the strange calm that settles when an entire state holds its breath under ice. It is a real history, retold gently, soothingly, like a soft whisper drifting through a winter storm. Before we begin, my friend, I'd like to invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments, especially those of you watching late at night from the U.S., early in the morning from Europe, relaxing in the quiet hours in Canada, or joining from anywhere else in the world. No matter what time your sky holds, your support helps this peaceful storytelling reach more dreamers across the globe. Now, take a moment to settle in. Adjust your pillow. Let your breathing slow. Feel your shoulders soften. Dim the lights, or simply close your eyes and let the stillness gather around you. This journey is meant to lull you, cradle you, and guide you gently toward rest as we walk through frozen memories and lingering warmth. When you are ready, we return to the heart of the narrative, Texas, 2021, where a winter storm swept across the plains and changed everything. The first whispers of the storm drifted in on an icy wind that felt out of place on the usually mild Texas plains. Days earlier, the sun had still been warm on front porches, drifting lazily over highway fields and open skies. But now, clouds gathered in slow, heavy layers, gray, dense, and low enough to seem almost close enough to touch. Across small towns, ranch lands, and stretching suburban neighborhoods, people watch the temperature fall in steady, startling drops. Windows fogged from the difference between indoor warmth and the sudden sting of the outside air. Even the birds seemed confused, hopping from branch to branch before disappearing into whatever shelter they could find. The cold deepened. Streets grew quiet. The air thickened with that peculiar winter silence, the kind that feels like the world is taking a long, cold inhale. Families tucked blankets around themselves. Pets curled close. Somewhere in the distance, a low hum of wind rose and fell like the ocean in slow motion. By nightfall, frost traced delicate patterns along rooftops and fences. Each patch of ice shimmered faintly under porch lights, as if winter itself were painting the world in silver strokes. Inside one home, or perhaps many, people checked weather apps, frowning softly. The forecast felt unreal. Temperatures that didn't belong here. A storm described in words that echoed more of the Arctic than the American South. And yet, the chill creeping beneath doors whispered that it was all true. As the first flakes drifted down, light as dust and quiet as breath, Texas slipped gently into the beginning of a freeze it had not been built to face. The snow fell softly through the dark, settling in slow layers across rooftops, highways, and quiet yards. At first it felt strangely peaceful, an unusual but gentle beauty, as though winter had come to Texas only to admire it. The lights in homes glowed warmly against the cold, and for a moment everything seemed calm, almost magical. But then something subtle shifted. Inside living rooms, the hum of heaters grew louder, straining as the temperature outside sank lower and lower. The storm clouds pressed heavily against the horizon, sealing the state beneath a blanket of frigid air. The snow thickened, falling in steady white curtains, settling into drifts that muffled the sound of passing cars and footsteps. And deep within the electrical grid, far beyond what any single family could see. Circuits strained, demand soared, and systems began to tremble under the weight of a cold they were never designed to endure. In one quiet neighborhood, a lamp flickered once, just a small, uncertain blink. In another home, a heater hesitated, struggling to keep up. People glanced at their appliances, waiting for them to resume their steady rhythm. Then, slowly, like a tide turning, Texas began slipping into darkness. Street by street, house by house, the lights dwindled. First a dim hallway, then a kitchen light, then entire blocks. The familiar orange glow of street lamps faded, replaced by the icy blue light reflected from the snow outside. Families looked at one another, wrapped themselves tighter in blankets. Phones lit faces in soft blue glows as people checked for updates, messages loading slowly, devices warning of low battery. The silence grew deeper as heaters stopped, fans stilled, and the comforting hum of electricity faded into a cold, echoing quiet. Outside, the wind sighed across the frozen landscape, brushing against shuttered windows, as though reminding everyone that the storm was only beginning. In the sudden stillness, millions found themselves in an unfamiliar world, one where the warmth they relied on had slipped away, leaving only the cold and the vast, dark night. Morning arrived without sunlight. A pale gray haze clung to the sky, filtering the dawn into something muted and distant. The world outside seemed paused, enclosed in a stillness so complete that even the air felt heavier. Snow blanketed driveways, cars, mailboxes, and entire streets in soft, untouched layers, smoothing every hard edge into gentle curves of white. Inside homes, breath hung in faint clouds as people stirred beneath piles of blankets. The cold had crept into every corner overnight, settling into walls and floors, making each movement slow and deliberate. Fingers brushed against icy doorknobs. Floors felt like frozen stone. Even simple tasks, opening a curtain, reaching for a coat, carried the weight of winter's quiet grip. Families gathered in living rooms, wrapped in sweaters, scarves, whatever warmth they could find. Children peeked through frosted windows, watching a world that looked beautiful but felt unforgiving. Parents checked their phones for news, screens dim from low battery, each update arriving slowly, if at all. Outside, the silence was almost eerie. No hum of traffic, no barking dogs, no distant whir of air conditioners. Only the faint whisper of wind swirling through snow-covered branches, and the occasional soft crack of ice shifting beneath its own weight. Neighbors stepped outside cautiously, their breaths rising in silver plumes. They exchanged quiet nods, shared small smiles, wrapped in worry, asked how the night had been. Words drifted upward and vanished into the cold. Some tried their car engines, only to hear the sluggish churn of engines resisting the freeze. Others scraped ice from windshields with gloved hands, pausing often to warm their fingers. And all around them, the cold pressed down, steady, crisp, unrelenting. Yet, in this frozen silence, moments of gentle resilience appeared. Someone brought extra firewood to a neighbor's porch. Someone checked on an elderly couple down the street. Someone shared a cup of hot coffee brewed over a small camping stove, steam rising like a hopeful signal into the winter air. The storm had arrived with force, but even in the deep cold, warmth found ways to flicker, quiet, human, and determined. As the hours stretched into the frozen morning, the cold inside each home deepened. Walls that once held the comfort of stored heat now felt chilled to the touch. The air grew stiller, denser, as if winter itself had settled inside the rooms. Yet people moved carefully, with quiet determination, searching for any warmth they could gather. In many houses, families gathered in a single room, the warmest one they could find. Blankets were piled high, layered like makeshift fortresses. Parents rubbed their children's hands to bring color back to their fingers. Pets nestled into laps or burrowed beneath covers, seeking the familiar comfort of shared body heat. Someone lit a candle, not for light, but for the small psychological warmth of its glow. Its flame flickered softly, casting dancing shadows on walls that had grown unfamiliar in the cold. Kitchens, usually lively and fragrant, became places of improvisation. People boiled water on gas stoves if they had them, warming their palms over the rising steam. Others used camping stoves or tiny portable burners, turning their countertops into survival stations. Even a simple mug of warm water felt like a luxury, heat seeping through cold fingertips. Outside, the neighborhood remained strangely quiet. Icicles hung from gutters like glass teeth, shimmering in the muted daylight. Snowdrifts leaned against doors. Frozen grass glistened beneath its icy armor. The landscape looked peaceful, almost serene, but the beauty carried a sharp edge, like a reminder that this cold was no gentle winter. Yet even with discomfort thick in the air, small kindnesses multiplied. Someone drove to check on a distant relative, their car tires crunching through layers of ice. A teenager walked house to house offering blankets. A couple brewed enough hot tea for the entire street. The storm had taken the power, but not the humanity woven through every community. People huddled close, sharing warmth through stories, jokes, whispered beneath blankets, and quiet reassurances that this moment, this cold, would pass. It was the soft resilience of ordinary people, glowing faintly in a world gone dim. By midday, the world outside had transformed into a frozen labyrinth. Streets that once carried the steady rhythm of daily life were now coated in a glassy sheen, turning every surface into a slick, treacherous mirror. What had started as soft snowfall hardened into layers of ice, thick, stubborn, and glistening beneath the pale winter light. Cars sat buried beneath blankets of snow, their windows opaque, their doors frozen shut. Tires were encased in half-melted ice that had refrozen in jagged formations. Anyone attempting to move their vehicle was met with the same cold resistance, a door handle stiff as stone, an engine that would not turn over, or wheels that spun helplessly on the frozen ground. Even the simplest step outdoors required caution. People walked slowly, planting each foot carefully, keeping arms out for balance. A single misstep could send someone sliding across their porch or stumbling into a snowbank. The air smelled crisp and metallic, the scent that comes when ice meets dry, bitter wind. Across the cities and towns, emergency vehicles struggled. Sirens echoed softly in the distance, their sound muffled by the snow-draped landscape. Trucks made to travel through rain and heat found themselves fighting the slick roads, fishtailing even at the slowest speeds. Some deliveries halted. Some buses stopped completely. Gas stations grew crowded with people trying to warm themselves inside the small heated shops. And yet, despite the danger outside, glimpses of determination shone through. A neighbor scraped ice away from a stranger's walkway. A passerby helped steady someone who nearly slipped. People opened their garages not to drive, but to hand out tools, shovels, de-icers, even old bags of sand saved for days far less severe than this one. Inside warm cars that had managed to start, People let engines run just long enough to take the chill off, just enough to remember what warm air felt like. But when they stepped back into the open, the wind whispered across the frozen roads like a reminder. The storm still holds Texas in its grasp. Still, the streets, with all their danger and difficulty, were just another chapter in a story of endurance. People learned to move more slowly, more carefully, adapting to this frozen world one step at a time. As the cold deepened and hours without power stretched longer, many homes began to feel less like shelter and more like fragile boxes struggling against the winter air. Temperatures indoors dropped to levels that made even the smallest movement send a chill through the body. Frost gathered at the edges of windows, and water in forgotten cups grew cold enough to sting. For some, it became clear they needed a different refuge, somewhere with heat, light, and a working source of power. Across Texas, warming centers and emergency shelters slowly opened their doors, glowing like islands of warmth in a sea of frozen quiet. People traveled toward them in small, careful groups. Some walked, bundled tightly in coats, scarves, and mismatched layers pulled from closets in the dim light. Others drove slowly along icy roads, hands gripping steering wheels, breath held with every turn. The journey was slow, uneasy, but filled with quiet hope, each mile bringing them closer to warmth. Inside the shelters, heat wrapped around newcomers like a gentle embrace. The scent of warm air, something normally unnoticed, felt almost nourishing. People shook off snow, rubbed their hands together, and breathed deeply as feeling returned to their fingers and toes. Cots lined the floors in neat rows. Blankets were handed out with soft smiles. Volunteers poured warm drinks, coffee, tea, broth, each cup sending curls of steam drifting upward like tiny clouds. The air hummed with low conversations, the rustle of coats, the clinking of metal thermoses, and the quiet relief of shared safety. Children colored quietly at tables. Parents watched them, exhaustion easing slightly from their faces. Elderly neighbors were helped into chairs, wrapped in blankets by people they had never met before. Even in hardship, warmth took many forms, not just heat, but kindness. Someone offered to charge another person's phone using a small portable battery. Someone shared snacks pulled from a backpack. Someone passed out extra socks. The storm may have pushed people into unfamiliar places, but it also knitted strangers into gentle, temporary communities. Outside, the night grew colder still, pressing against the shelter walls. But inside, the glow of human resilience burned softly, steady, warm, and unwavering. As the freeze tightened its grip, another quiet crisis took shape, one that flowed through pipes and faucets, hidden until it suddenly wasn't. Texas, a state accustomed to heat and sun, found its water systems locked in a battle against temperatures far below anything they were built to endure. In countless homes, the first signs were subtle. A faucet sputtered before slowing to a thin, trembling trickle. A showerhead produced only a few drops that clung like beads of glass. Sinks gurgled softly, as if struggling to breathe. Then, without warning, the flow stopped altogether, leaving only silence where the steady sound of running water had always been taken for granted. Behind walls, pipes froze solid. Some swelled under pressure, some cracked quietly, unnoticed until the thaw to come. The cold dug deeper, creeping into the hidden places of homes, turning water into ice with a quiet, unrelenting determination. People opened cabinets, let warm air reach the pipes, wrapped towels around them, prayed the metal wouldn't burst. They filled pots with melting snow, scooped ice into buckets, collected water dripping from roofs into clean containers, Each small act became part of a new routine born from necessity, not comfort. Outside, water mains struggled too. Breaks sent geysers of freezing water arcing into the sky. Beautiful in a way, but dangerous. They crystallized into shimmering sculptures, freezing mid-air, coating sidewalks and cars in thick glassy layers. Crews worked around the clock, their breath forming clouds as they fought to contain the bursts. But the cold moved faster, biting deeper. At grocery stores, shelves that once held bottled water emptied quickly. People waited in long, patient lines wrapped in coats, stamping their feet for warmth, hoping to find at least a jug or two. Neighbors shared what they had, offering a bottle here, a gallon there, knowing every drop mattered. Inside homes where taps had gone dry, families adapted with quiet endurance. They rationed what water they had. They boiled snow for cooking. They washed hands sparingly, using warm cloths instead of running faucets. It was a strange reversal surrounded by ice, yet lacking the simplest liquid warmth. Still, hope flickered even here. A neighbor delivered several gallons to an elderly couple down the street. A family melted snow on a stove and shared the warm water with friends who had none. Even when resources ran thin, generosity remained abundant. The cold had stolen much, but not kindness, not humanity, not the determination to get through one frozen day at a time. As dusk settled once more over Texas, the air grew sharper, the shadows longer, and the temperature fell with a quiet, relentless certainty. The second night of the deep freeze unfolded slowly, pressing down on homes already chilled to their core. Inside darkened rooms, people gathered close again. Blankets rustled softly as they wrapped themselves in layers. 2, 3, sometimes more. With each passing hour, the cold seeped further into the walls and floors, turning every surface into something that felt almost alive with frost. Touching a doorknob, a countertop, even the edge of a window sent a shiver up the arm. Breath rose in faint clouds. The air held a stillness so complete that every small sound, the creak of a settling house, the distant crack of expanding ice, felt amplified. Candles burned in little halos of gold. Battery lanterns cast faint circles of light that trembled like soft moons on the walls. Even phones, dimmed to conserve power, became tiny glowing stars in the dark. Outside, the wind moved across the frozen landscape like a slow, cold tide. It brushed against rooftops, rattled brittle branches, and carried a faint, low whistle that drifted through the night. Streets lay empty, covered in untouched sheets of ice that reflected whatever starlight broke through the clouds. In some homes, families took turns keeping watch over fireplaces or small camp stoves, feeding them sparingly with fuel, making sure warmth, however small, continued. People boiled water when they could, letting the steam warm their faces for a moment of relief. Across neighborhoods, the hush of the night was broken only by occasional sounds: a distant siren, a crack of freezing wood, a soft knock as neighbors checked on one another. Even animals moved quietly. Dogs pressed close to their owners, cats curled beneath blankets, and wild creatures sought shelter wherever they could find it. Yet amid the cold and darkness, there were moments of peace. Conversations whispered softly under blankets. Laughter bubbled gently from children who turned flashlights into makeshift night games. A couple sat side by side beneath quilts, sharing a single thermos of warm tea. Friends texted one another good-night messages, even if they knew replies might come slowly. Human warmth persisted, quiet, steady, glowing faintly in every darkened home. It was a long night, a hard night, but also a night filled with resilience, with people finding comfort in one another when the world outside offered so little. While families huddled beneath blankets and communities shared what warmth they could far above the freezing rooftops and deep beneath the quiet ground, Texas's power grid groaned under extraordinary strain. It was an invisible struggle, unseen yet felt, in every cold room, every flickering candle, every silent heater. All across the state, generators, power plants, and transmission lines, usually built for scorching summers, not Arctic cold, fought to stay alive. Some facilities were coated in ice thick enough to seize moving parts. Others froze completely as valves stiffened, sensors malfunctioned, and turbines slowed in the biting air. The grid, designed for independence and efficiency, now stood fragile under the weight of a storm it had never been prepared to meet. Reports filtered through slowly, often delayed by the very outages they described. People learned that power plants were shutting down in chain reactions, that natural gas lines had frozen, that the demand for heat was so high it outpaced supply many times over. Engineers worked through the night, bundled in layers, their breath forming clouds as they braved the frozen facilities. They chipped away ice with tools warmed under their coats. They restarted turbines with numb fingers. They rushed from one failing part of the system to another, racing the cold that seeped into everything it touched. But even their efforts could not stop the inevitable. Rolling blackouts became statewide darkness. In homes still waiting for electricity to return, the news brought a strange mix of fear and understanding. The problem wasn't just their neighborhood. It wasn't a single line down or a local surge. It was Texas as a whole. Millions of people connected by a vast, struggling web that had begun to fracture under the storm. Some households received brief flickers of hope, lights clicking on for a few minutes, heaters humming to life just long enough to remind residents of what warmth felt like, before shutting off once more to preserve power elsewhere. Those few minutes became treasured moments. People used them to boil water, charge phones, or warm their hands near vents before the house returned to stillness. And yet, amid the crisis, there was quiet determination. Electric workers labored through the coldest nights Texas had seen in decades. They wrapped themselves in insulated suits, climbed icy poles, repaired frozen transformers, and coordinated tirelessly with distant teams. They became, in many ways, the silent guardians of a state blanketed in darkness. The grid was straining, faltering, failing in places, but not abandoned, not forgotten. It was held together by hands that refused to give up. As the freeze dragged on, a new sense of urgency descended across Texas. What began as a winter storm had now grown into a full-scale emergency, one that stretched from bustling city streets to the quietest country roads. The cold touched everyone, leaving no home, no family, no corner of the state untouched. Hospitals, already burdened, felt the strain almost immediately. Inside their dimly lit halls, backup generators hummed steadily, fighting to keep critical equipment alive. Nurses wrapped patients in extra blankets while checking vitals with hands chilled despite warm gloves. Doctors moved quickly through frost-edged corridors, their breath visible in rooms that were never meant to grow this cold. Outside, ambulances struggled along icy roads, weaving between abandoned vehicles that had slid off into snowbanks. Paramedics bundled themselves tightly, rushing to reach people suffering from hypothermia, falls, and dangerous exposure. Each call took longer. Each mile felt heavier. In fire stations, crews warmed their hands near small heaters, ready for emergencies that continued to mount. They cleared blocked roads, delivered supplies, and helped rescue stranded drivers. Their boots left deep prints in the snow as they moved from one call to the next, guided by dedication, even when exhaustion tugged at them. Grocery stores opened cautiously when they could, lights flickering as generators tried to keep food from spoiling. People lined up outside in thick coats and scarves, waiting patiently as employees passed out essential items: water, bread, canned goods, often limited but deeply appreciated. Even the simple sound of a store's heater running felt like a miracle. City leaders and emergency officials worked through sleepless nights. They coordinated warming centers, delivered notifications, and urged people to conserve what little resources they had. Messages buzzed through phones, sometimes late, sometimes lost to weak signals, but each one reminding residents that they were not alone. The storm had revealed vulnerabilities few expected, yet it also illuminated something else: an immense collective determination. Communities organized donation drives under parking lot tents. Volunteers checked on those who lived alone. Families, separated by icy roads, found ways to reach one another by phone or text, offering comforting words when warmth was scarce. In the midst of the chaos, the air was filled with quiet acts of bravery and resilience. A firefighter carrying an elderly resident to safety across a sheet of ice. A nurse holding a patient's hand during a generator outage. A neighbor trudging through snow with a backpack full of food for the family next door. The emergency was vast. The night was cold. But the heart of Texas beat steadily, refusing to be frozen by the storm. With power still absent in many homes and the bitter cold refusing to relent, people across Texas turned to whatever sources of heat they could find. Fireplaces that had sat unused for years were suddenly lit. Small stoves glowed in living rooms. Candles burned low and steady. Anything that offered warmth became precious. But even warmth in these desperate hours carried risk. In some neighborhoods, the scent of wood smoke drifted gently through the frozen air. It curled upward from chimneys, creating soft gray plumes that rose against the pale sky. Inside those houses, families huddled close near the hearth, listening to the crackle of burning logs. The flames painted their faces in soft gold, a stark contrast to the icy blue world outside. Yet not every home had a working fireplace. Not every home had safe heating, and so improvisations began, some careful, some dangerous. Portable heaters glowed in dim rooms. Gas burners flickered under pots of hot water. People layered towels at the bottoms of doors to keep in the precious warmth. In one apartment, a family sat wrapped in blankets next to a single flickering candle, speaking softly so their voices wouldn't disturb the fragile peace. But with improvisation came risk. Fire departments responded to calls of smoke-filled rooms where heaters malfunctioned or candles tipped too close to piles of blankets. They rushed through dark, icy streets to reach homes where carbon monoxide alarms had begun to scream, low, shrill warnings that barely rose above the cold silence. Some residents, unaware of the danger, brought outdoor grills indoors, seeking warmth. The air filled with unseen, odorless threat. Emergency crews worked tirelessly to save families overcome by fumes, carrying them into the cold night where the air, though bitter, was at least safe to breathe. Through it all, neighbors stayed vigilant. People checked on each other with small knocks on frosted doors. Someone shouted across a snowy yard, warning others not to use charcoal inside. A stranger lent a battery-powered detector to a family who had none. Warnings spread by word of mouth, by text, by handwritten notes taped to frozen mailboxes. And still, the fires, those controlled and those nearly dangerous, remained symbols of hope, tiny beacons of warmth in a world that had gone cold and still. In living rooms across the state, families held their hands toward the glow of a single flame, feeling its warmth spread slowly into their chilled palms. The fire crackled softly, steady and reassuring, like a heartbeat in the silence. It reminded them that even in the coldest nights, a spark of warmth could still be found. By the third day of the deep freeze, a quiet desperation settled over many Texas homes. It wasn't loud or panicked. Rather, it was a slow, heavy feeling that lingered in the air like frost on a window. A recognition that the cold was not just a passing visitor, but a force that had woven itself into every moment, every breath, every choice. Rooms that once felt familiar now felt distant and altered. Furniture was cold to the touch, mirrors fogged not from humidity, but from the warmth of a person standing too close. Water glasses left on counters formed thin rims of ice. Even blankets, though thick and layered, felt as if they could only chase away so much of the cold before giving in. People moved more slowly, conserving energy, shoulders hunched against the chill. Conversations were kept brief to save breath from fogging the air unnecessarily. Hands stayed tucked into pockets or wrapped around warm mugs made from melted snow or the last boiled water. Food became a careful calculation. Refrigerators without power no longer hummed reassuringly in kitchens. Some people placed perishables outside, letting the freezing air preserve what the appliances could not. Snow-packed coolers sat on back porches. Meals were simple, canned soups warmed over small flames, bread eaten quickly so it wouldn't harden. Phones, their batteries draining steadily in the cold, were handled sparingly. A quick message to a loved one. "Are you okay? Do you have water? Please stay warm." Then the device would be turned off again, wrapped in a blanket like something fragile and sacred. Shelves, where supplies once sat, became emptier by the hour. Neighbors shared what they had, but even generosity had its limits. A family might offer an extra loaf of bread or a few bottles of water, knowing they could not spare much more. Still, kindness persisted, quiet, humble, given without hesitation. Some tried to distract themselves from the cold with small rituals, reading by candlelight, telling stories beneath blankets, whispered prayers in dim rooms, games played by the faint glow of battery lanterns. These moments, though simple, carried the weight of comfort. Yet beneath the resilience, there was a deep weariness, a longing for warmth, for light, for the familiar hum of life returning. Outside, the world remained frozen and still. Icicles hung like sharp crystals from every roof, snowbanks pressed against doors. The sky stretched across the state in muted shades of white and gray, offering no hint of thaw. But even in this quiet desperation, hope survived. It flickered like a faint flame in a windstorm, small but persistent. Every act of care, every shared resource, every whispered reassurance was a reminder that even in the hardest nights, Texans were holding on together. In the heart of the freeze, when the cold felt heaviest and the night stretched long and silent, something quietly beautiful began to weave itself through towns and neighborhoods across Texas. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it wasn't even always visible, but it was there. Thin, warm threads of community binding people to one another when everything else felt frigid and fragile. It started with small gestures, a neighbor leaving a thermos of hot soup on a doorstep, knocking gently and stepping back into the snow before the door opened. Another shoveling a narrow path through a walkway that wasn't their own. Someone sharing a bundle of firewood with a family whose supply had dwindled to a few thin logs. Word of mouth, whispered phone calls, texts sent before batteries died, brief conversations shouted from porch to porch, spread news of who needed help, who had extra blankets, who had a working stove, who had a car that could make it down the icy road to check on an elderly relative. People who had never spoken beyond a wave now found themselves sharing resources like dear friends. Inside dimly lit living rooms, households welcomed neighbors who needed warmth. Families sat together for hours, wrapped in shared quilts, taking comfort in the closeness of others. Children played with new friends by lantern light, their laughter soft but bright against the stillness. Even pets nestled together, cats and dogs curled near one another for warmth, forgetting the usual lines they drew. Churches opened their doors, offering not just shelter, but a sense of belonging. Volunteers handed out hot meals cooked on donated propane stoves. Musicians played quiet melodies on acoustic guitars, their notes drifting through the cold air like small sparks of comfort. In apartment complexes, people knocked door to door, checking on those who lived alone. A single text thread, half the messages delayed, others arriving at once, became a lifeline for an entire building, each resident updating the others on what they had, what they needed, what they could share. Strangers became caretakers, neighbors became companions in resilience, and all across the state, even in the darkest corners where the cold felt deepest, those threads of community shone softly, weaving warmth where heaters could not reach. Though the storm had taken power, water, and comfort, it couldn't take away this quiet unity. In fact, it seemed to strengthen it, drawing people together in ways they would remember long after the ice melted. In a world frozen still as the warmth came from each other. As the freeze persisted and roads remained coated in ice, the rhythm of everyday life ground to a halt. Supply trucks, unable to navigate the frozen highways, stalled miles from their destinations. Markets that once bustled with steady foot traffic now opened only sporadically, operating on dim backup power or none at all. And when their doors did open, the shelves inside told the story of a state stretched thin. Under soft emergency lighting, grocery aisles looked unfamiliar, quiet, sparse, nearly empty. Rows that once held water bottles were bare, except for a few cracked containers left behind. Bread shelves were cleared to the back panels. Refrigerators hummed weakly or stood silent, their contents reduced to scattered cartons, lone packages, items long since picked over. People walked slowly through these dim corridors, bundled in coats and scarves, their breath visible in the chilled air. Shopping carts rattled softly on tiles that felt colder than usual. Some customers carried lists, others simply hoped to find anything they could bring home. Employees, weary yet steady, guided people gently. We have a few more canned goods in the back, one would say. We're expecting another delivery, but we don't know when, another whispered with an apologetic smile. In some stores, candles were sold out entirely, matches too. Many families relied on flashlights now, guarding their precious batteries like treasure. And though scarcity pressed hard on everyone, the atmosphere inside these cold markets was strangely calm. People moved carefully, patiently. They nodded to one another, offered small greetings, and avoided taking more than they needed. A mother, finding the last pack of diapers, handed it to another mother whose relief was visible even behind her scarf. A man lifted a case of water from his cart and split it with an older couple, who had arrived too late to find any. A teenager used his last few dollars to buy candles, not for himself, but for a neighbor who had none. Outside, the parking lots were quietly dusted with snow, cars slipping cautiously in and out as people returned home with what little they had found. The air was sharp and biting, but the small victories, one can of soup, a box of crackers, a gallon of water, felt significant. These markets, dim and depleted, became places where resilience was measured not in abundance, but in generosity. Even in scarcity, Texans found ways to share. Even in cold, they found ways to care. By the next morning, something subtle, but unmistakable, shifted in the frozen world outside. The air still held its razor-edge chill, but it felt different, softer around the edges. A hint of something new, something quietly promising, drifted through the stillness. It began with sound. Not the wind, not the quiet crunch of footsteps in deep snow, but a faint, delicate tapping, like 1,000 tiny fingers drumming gently on rooftops and eaves. Icicles, long and razor-sharp, began to drip in slow, hesitant drops. Each fall of water hit the frozen ground with a soft click, the beginning of a rhythm that grew steadier with every passing minute. People heard it from inside their homes and paused. It was not warmth yet, but it was the sound of change. Throughout neighborhoods, snowbanks softened slightly, their crisp edges blurring. The air, still cold enough to sting, carried a dampness that hadn't been there before, a whisper that temperatures were inching upward, if only by a breath. Inside homes, the faint sound of melting felt almost surreal. After days of freezing stillness, the gentle dripping was like music, soft, patient, comforting, a reminder that the storm, however powerful, was not endless. Families cautiously peered out frosted windows. They saw icicles thinning, water sliding down gutters in slender streams, steam rising faintly from patches of dark asphalt where snow had begun to retreat. But even this fragile hope carried its own challenges. Melting snow revealed burst pipes beneath houses, sending trickles, or in some cases spurts, of water into yards and streets. Fallen branches, heavy with the memory of ice, lay scattered across sidewalks. Roads that had been solid sheets of white turned slick with slush, making every step uncertain and every drive unpredictable. Still, Texans stepped outside, slowly, carefully, with the kind of courage born from endurance. Bundled figures moved through their neighborhoods, checking on one another, clearing pathways, lifting broken branches, guiding melting water away from homes and into gutters. Children, seeing the softened snow, ventured out to gather handfuls of slush, laughing quietly as their gloves soaked through. The world was not warm, not yet, but it was thawing, it was moving, it was waking. And with every drop of melting ice, hope stretched its limbs a little more. In living rooms still lit by lanterns and candles, people smiled, not because the hardship was over, but because they could finally hear the first soft notes of change. It happened slowly at first, so slowly that many didn't realize the moment had come until it was already there. After days of darkness, flickering candles, and cold rooms filled with breath clouds, the return of electricity arrived not with fanfare, but with a soft, almost shy glow. In one home, a lamp blinked once, twice, as if waking from a long sleep. In another, a heater coughed to life, blowing out a stream of air that felt like a warm sigh. Across entire neighborhoods, tiny points of light appeared in windows, spreading like stars reawakening in a night sky. People noticed it in different ways. A refrigerator suddenly hummed. A phone buzzed with delayed messages. A television screen flickered on, its glow illuminating faces that had grown accustomed to darkness. For a moment, Texas paused, listening, watching, unsure if this fragile gift would last. And then, relief swept through homes like a gentle wave. Children cheered softly beneath blankets. Adults let out long exhales they didn't realize they'd been holding. Pets stretched near heaters, sinking into the warmth as if reclaiming a forgotten comfort. Families gathered around vents, letting warm air wash over chilled skin. Some cried quietly, tears warmed by the first true heat they had felt in days. But even as light returned, caution held its place beside relief. Many knew the power might flicker again. Some areas remained dark, while others glowed. The grid was healing, but still fragile, and so people moved mindfully. They charged phones quickly, knowing every minute mattered. They boiled water while they could. They warmed rooms slowly, giving heaters time to recover. They offered outlets to neighbors who were still waiting in the cold. Outside, the streets remained icy, but porch lights cast long, hopeful shadows across the snow. Light pooled onto driveways, glimmering off melting icicles. Homes that had looked lifeless only hours earlier now felt alive, softly lit, gently stirring, breathing warmth back into their walls. In apartment buildings, cheers echoed down hallways. In rural towns, lights on a distant hill signaled hope to those still waiting. In cities, skyscrapers lit floor by floor, turning the skyline from a cold silhouette into a beacon. The darkness had not fully lifted, but it was breaking, slowly, gently, one home at a time. And through it all, gratitude wove itself into every moment. Gratitude for warmth, for light, for the simple miracle of electricity returning after days of cold silence. As the warmth slowly crept back into Texas, first in gentle breaths, then in fuller waves, another reality began to surface. The thaw did not come quietly. It revealed everything the deep freeze had hidden: the cracks, the breaks, the wounds left behind in days of bitter cold. Water that had frozen silently inside pipes now returned with force. In some homes, it started as a drip, a soft tap, tap, tap from behind a wall, a growing puddle beneath a sink, a dark stain spreading slowly across a ceiling. In others, the break was sudden, an eruption of water bursting from a ruptured pipe, sending cold streams across floors and down staircases. Carpets darkened instantly. Hardwood floors warped, boxes stored in garages and closets soaked through. Families scrambled with towels, buckets, anything they could find to contain the flow. They shut off valves, called plumbers whose phone lines buzzed nonstop, and worked together to save what belongings they could from the unexpected flood. The sound of dripping water joined the hum of returning heaters, creating a strange duet of disaster and recovery. Outside, the thaw revealed its own scars. Icicles cracked and fell in heavy chunks, shattering on driveways. Roofs shed layers of melting snow, the runoff forming little rivers along sidewalks. Streets, still holding pockets of ice, grew pocked with slush-filled potholes. Fallen branches, once suspended in frozen stillness, lay scattered across yards like the remnants of a long battle. Crews moved through neighborhoods with chainsaws and repair trucks, clearing debris, checking power lines, and patching roads. Their boots splashed through slush as they worked with cautious optimism, knowing that even though the worst of the cold had passed, the work was far from over. Yet amid the damage, people found grace. Neighbors helped each other lift waterlogged furniture onto porches to dry. Volunteers delivered buckets and tarps to families whose homes had flooded. Someone offered to help patch a broken pipe. Someone else brought fans to dry floors. Children stepped over puddles with a sense of curiosity rather than fear, sensing the change in the air. And everywhere, the sound of dripping water persisted, steady, rhythmic, almost soothing. A reminder that things were shifting, healing, moving forward. Though the thaw revealed the cracks, it also brought the promise of repair. Though the water spilled through walls and ceilings, warmth was returning to take its place. Though the storm had left its mark, Texans were beginning to rise from beneath the ice. As the days after the freeze unfolded, a new rhythm took shape across Texas, a rhythm built not around snowfall or darkness, but around long, patient lines. Lines for groceries, lines for water, lines for supplies, lines for assistance. People bundled in coats and scarves stood quietly beneath the pale winter sun, waiting for the help they needed to begin putting their lives back together. At community centers and churches, tables were set up beneath tents, each one filled with essential items: bottled water, canned food, blankets, hygiene kits. Volunteers worked tirelessly, their hands red from the cold, their voices warm as they guided people forward, one at a time. The lines moved slowly, but they moved. A mother cradled her child close as they inched forward. An elderly man leaned on his cane, grateful for the folding chair someone placed behind him. A teenager carried bags not just for his family, but for two neighbors who couldn't make the trip. At water distribution sites, cars stretched down blocks, engines idling softly. Trunks were popped open with the quiet click of frozen hinges. Volunteers lifted cases of water inside with gentle efficiency, offering a few words of encouragement before waving the next vehicle forward. Gas stations, too, saw their own lines, people filling containers to fuel generators or to travel to relatives whose homes had been spared the worst. The air hummed with the soft whir of pumps and the muffled conversations of strangers sharing their experiences. Everywhere, the lines revealed stories. Someone spoke of a pipe bursting in the middle of the night. Someone else described melting snow on a stove for drinking water. Another person talked about driving miles just to find baby formula or medicine. These stories didn't flow with panic, but with calm resilience, as if each person understood they were part of a larger tapestry of endurance. Inside the distribution centers, the warmth wrapped around those who entered. Portable heaters buzzing softly, volunteers offering hot drinks, smiles visible even behind masks. It wasn't just supplies being given out, it was comfort, dignity, connection. When people finally reached the front of the line, they accepted their items with murmured thank yous, nods of appreciation, and shoulders relaxing just slightly, relief settling in like a small, welcome flame. Outside, the sun, still faint, still distant, glimmered across melting patches of snow. The air smelled of slush, damp earth, and hope stirring beneath the thaw. Waiting wasn't easy. But in every line across the state, Texans stood together, quiet, steady, helping one another inch forward one person at a time. On the morning that followed, something almost miraculous drifted through the Texas air. A softness, a faint warmth that felt out of place yet deeply welcome. It wasn't much at first. The breeze was still cool, still carrying traces of the storm that had gripped the state for days. But it was warm enough to feel like a promise. People noticed it in quiet, tender ways. A single window cracked open for the first time since the freeze, letting in air that felt crisp but no longer biting. A coat unbuttoned halfway, during a walk to check the mail. Gloves tucked into pockets instead of clinging tightly to cold fingers. Outside, the world began to loosen its icy hold. Snow that once clung stubbornly to rooftops softened into patches of slush. Icicles thinned, dripping steadily until their sharp tips softened and fell away. Puddles formed at the edges of driveways, reflecting a sky that seemed brighter, still pale, still wintry, but with hints of blue peeking through. People stepped outside and closed their eyes, tilting their faces toward the subtle warmth. Even the birds seemed to sense the change, sparrows hopping along fences, calling out with cautious chirps, testing the air for signs of spring. For the first time in days, the air smelled different, not frozen, not metallic, but damp, alive, like the earth underneath the snow was finally stirring. Neighbors met outside without shivering immediately, exchanging tired but hopeful smiles. Conversations stretched a bit longer. The cold no longer chased people back indoors so quickly. Children ventured out without 3 layers of jackets, poking at melting snowbanks with sticks, laughing as they watched tiny rivers of water run down the sidewalks. Pets sniffed the air eagerly, sensing the shift before their owners did. Inside homes, heaters clicked and hummed with more confidence. Rooms warmed gradually, chasing away the chill embedded in furniture and walls. People moved more freely, less burdened by the cold, more energized by the gentle promise of returning warmth. Even the sky reflected the change. Clouds parted just enough to let sunlight spill across the ground in thin golden streaks. It wasn't strong, but it was real, warm against the skin, a reminder that seasons always move forward. And in that first warm breeze, Texas breathed deeply again. The worst had passed. The thaw had begun. And though recovery still stretched out ahead, messy, slow, and full of challenges, the air carried hope, soft, warm, undeniable. With the warmth growing stronger each day, the frozen grip on Texas's roads finally began to ease. What had once been solid sheets of ice, glossy, treacherous, and utterly silent, now transformed into softening slush that yielded beneath the first brave footsteps. The roads were far from perfect, but they were waking. Across neighborhoods, the quiet crackle of thawing ice echoed through the morning air. Patches of asphalt emerged like islands in a sea of melting white, dark and wet beneath streams of water that trickled toward storm drains. Snowbanks that had towered over curbs shrank slowly, their edges collapsing as the sun traced gentle paths across them. People stepped outside, testing the ground with cautious optimism. Boots pressed into slush with a satisfying crunch. Tires splashed softly through shallow puddles. The world felt less brittle, less fragile. No longer a frozen sculpture, but something fluid, alive. As roads became passable, even if unevenly, life regained small freedoms. Cars that had slept beneath thick layers of ice were uncovered. Engines groaned awake after days of stillness. Windshields cleared of frost, slowly revealing the familiar view of driveways, mailboxes, and neighbors doing the same. For some, the ability to drive again meant reassurance, a chance to check on loved ones in person, a chance to replenish dwindling supplies, a chance to feel the simple normalcy of movement. Traffic lights blinked back to life one by one, their colors reflecting off damp pavement. A red glow painted the melting snow, a green shimmer rippled across wet streets. Even these small lights felt like milestones, symbols of a world inching toward recovery. Repair trucks lined the roads, their flashing amber lights glinting through misty air. Workers moved from block to block, clearing fallen branches, patching potholes, and inspecting lines that had survived the storm. They waded through puddles with measured steps, their boots splashing as they performed the quiet, necessary tasks of rebuilding. School buses sat motionless in lots, still waiting, but no longer buried in ice. Delivery trucks ventured out with caution. Neighbors waved to each other from rolled-down windows, exchanging signs of relief. And as the roads reopened, they carried more than just cars. They carried hope. Hope in motion. Hope in progress. Hope in the simple act of traveling from one place to another without fear of slipping off the world's frozen edge. The storm had slowed everything. But now the roads were returning, slowly, steadily, bringing Texas one step closer to its familiar rhythm. As the ice melted from rooftops and roads, another kind of thaw began, one that took place not outside, but deep within the people who had endured the freeze. For days, Texans had tightened their bodies against the cold, bracing themselves against every shiver, every dark hour, every uncertain night. Now, as warmth crept back into homes and sunlight returned in soft, golden threads, emotions long held frozen began to loosen too. It started quietly, the way real healing often does. Someone sat on their couch, finally warmed, and let out a long breath that trembled on the way out, the kind of exhale that carries days of tension with it. Another person stood at their kitchen counter, hand resting on a mug of hot tea, and felt tears prick their eyes, not from sorrow, but from relief. Children, now able to shed their heavy blankets, played more freely, laughter rising like tiny bells ringing through the house. Inside many homes, conversations that had been whispered under layers of quilts now flowed openly. Families talked about the moment the power went out, the night the temperature dipped too low, the worry that had sat heavy in their chests. Each shared memory felt lighter, spoken aloud, a burden unpacked and set gently aside. Some people found themselves wandering room to room, touching objects suddenly warm again, walls, countertops, doorknobs, marveling at how normalcy felt strange after the freeze. Heaters clicking on, water running from faucets, lights responding instantly to a switch, everyday miracles rediscovered. Others stepped outside, face turned to the sky, letting the soft breeze brush against them as if to confirm that yes, the worst had truly passed. But the thaw of emotion wasn't only relief, it was gratitude. Gratitude for neighbors who had checked on them, for volunteers who had braved the cold to deliver supplies, for friends who had sent messages of comfort even when cell service faltered, for community threads that held strong when the infrastructure did not. People reflected on small moments that had meant everything during the storm. A shared blanket, a mug of hot broth, a flashlight loaned without hesitation. These memories warmed them now in ways no heater ever could. There was also a quiet resolve, a promise whispered inwardly. Next time, we'll be better prepared. Next time, we'll watch out for each other even sooner. And yet, beneath all of it, relief, gratitude, resolve, there remained a gentle softness, a tenderness toward the simple things, warmth, light, running water, a fully charged phone, the hum of life returning. The emotional unfreezing had begun, slow and gentle, like the first drip of melted ice. Healing would take time, but hearts, like homes, were warming. As warmth gradually returned and the last stubborn patches of snow shrank in corners of shaded yards, Texans turned their attention to the work ahead, work that was practical, physical, and deeply human. The freeze had left its mark on homes and buildings across the state, and now those wounds began to reveal themselves more clearly. In countless neighborhoods, the sounds of recovery replaced the eerie quiet of the storm. Hammers tapping gently against wood, the whir of drills echoing down streets, water sloshing into buckets as pipes were drained and repaired, metal ladders scraping softly as they were propped against roofs. Inside homes where pipes had burst, families worked together to clear debris and dry their floors. Towels were laid out in long, overlapping lines, collecting the last of the melted chaos. Fans, pulled from closets or borrowed from neighbors, hummed steadily, pushing warm air across damp spaces. Walls were opened carefully, insulation removed, broken pipes exposed like bones needing mending. Plumbers moved from house to house, their schedules overflowing, yet they offered steady reassurance with each repair. "It's fixable," they said. "We'll get your water running again. Give it time. Your home will dry." Electricians replaced damaged lines. Roofers patched shingles loosened by ice. Contractors inspected attics, crawl spaces, garages, checking for hidden damage. Neighbors helped wherever they could. Someone held a flashlight for a friend working in a dark corner of the house. Someone loaned tools no store had in stock yet. Someone knelt in the mud outside a neighbor's home, helping clear ice-blocked drains so melting water flowed away safely. Children joined the efforts too, in their own gentle ways. They picked up fallen branches and stacked them neatly. They swept small puddles from porches. They carried cups of warm tea to adults working tirelessly. Inside community centers, donations piled up, not just food or water, but building supplies, boxes of nails, rolls of tape, coils of wire. Patching kits, even carpet remnants for families who needed to replace what had been lost. The work was exhausting, but it came with a rhythm that felt hopeful. Each repaired pipe was a small victory. Each restored light switch a quiet triumph. Each steady flow of warm water from a newly fixed faucet felt like a blessing. Homes were healing slowly, gently. And as they did, so were the people inside them. With every wall patched, every leak sealed, every room warmed again, Texas moved a little further from the freeze and a little closer to normalcy. As more homes regained electricity and water trickled back into faucets with reassuring steadiness, kitchens that had fallen silent during the freeze slowly came back to life. The hum of refrigerators returned, ovens clicked on with familiar warmth, and the scent of comfort food began to drift through neighborhoods, gentle, welcoming, a sign that life was finding its rhythm again. And with warmth came gathering. Families invited neighbors who still lacked water or power to join them around kitchen tables, now bathed in the soft glow of working lights. Steam rose from bowls of soup, from pots of chili simmering on stoves, from mugs of hot cocoa cradled between hands still recovering from days of cold. Food became more than nourishment. It became connection. Around these tables, stories emerged. Someone described the moment their pipes burst, water rushing like a river into the hallway, turning the floor into a shallow lake. Another shared how their family slept in one room for 3 nights, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their dog nestled between them for warmth. One person recounted melting snow in a large pot just to boil pasta, laughing softly now at the memory of how strange and resourceful it had felt at the time. With each story, the fear and tension of the past days loosened. Laughter, hesitant at first, then freer, filled the spaces that cold had once occupied. The storm had created hardship, but it had also created stories people would carry with them for years, told and retold at gatherings like this. Someone remembered the neighbor who brought firewood in the dark of night. Someone else talked about the volunteer who delivered water with a smile despite the freezing wind. Another recalled seeing the first flicker of power return and crying with relief. These moments, shared over warm meals, became threads of gratitude woven into the fabric of recovery. Children listened wide-eyed, their spoons paused mid-air as they imagined the world of ice and darkness their parents described. Elders shook their heads in gentle disbelief, reflecting on how rare and powerful such a storm had been. Outside, night fell softly, but homes glowed brightly, windows shining like lanterns across the recovering streets. Inside, conversations stretched late into the evening, comforted by the presence of warmth, food, and one another. The storm had isolated many, but in its aftermath, it brought people together in deeper ways than anyone expected. The tables that once held emergency candles now held shared meals and shared memories. And the warmth of food, of connection, of being safe again, settled deep into hearts long chilled by the freeze. As Texas slowly stepped out of the shadow of the storm, people found themselves reflecting, not just on what had happened, but on what it had taught them. Moments of hardship often leave behind quiet lessons, written not in ink, but in experience, and the deep freeze had carved its teachings into the memories of millions. These lessons appeared in gentle waves. Some discovered how strong they truly were, able to endure dark nights, freezing rooms, and long hours of uncertainty. Others realized just how deeply they depended on simple comforts: a warm room, a working faucet, a light switch that responded instantly. Many learned the value of preparation, of keeping extra blankets, water, batteries, and a plan for when the unexpected arrives. And weaving through every reflection was one truth: people mattered more than anything else. Texans spoke softly about how neighbors had appeared at their doorsteps when the world outside felt unlivable, about how communities had formed overnight, messy, humble, imperfect, yet powerful, about how human kindness had filled the gaps where infrastructure had failed. Families created small lists on their refrigerators titled "Next Time," not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Next time, keep more candles. Next time, insulate pipes better. Next time, check on neighbors sooner. Next time, trust that community is the strongest force of all. Officials, planners, and leaders held meetings, virtual or in person, discussing what had gone wrong and what must change. People tuned in, wanting answers, wanting reassurance, wanting to believe that this chapter would guide the next. The freeze became a catalyst for conversations about resilience, preparedness, and the delicate balance between comfort and vulnerability. In schools, teachers invited students to share their experiences. Children spoke of sleeping in hats and gloves, of bringing snow inside to melt, of watching their parents navigate challenges with quiet determination. These stories, spoken in small voices, carried truths larger than the room around them. In workplaces, co-workers exchanged freeze memories, some light, some heavy, as a way of healing through shared understanding. Even in casual conversations at grocery stores newly restocked, people found themselves talking about the storm. How did you manage? Did your pipes burst? Did you ever lose power? Each exchange a reminder that everyone had walked through the same cold, the same uncertainty, the same long nights. And above all, the lessons remained, gentle but firm, like footprints left in melting snow. Lessons about fragility, lessons about strength, lessons about community, lessons about the quiet courage found in ordinary people during extraordinary times. When Texans looked back, they didn't see only ice and darkness. They saw themselves, weathered, tested, changed, and still standing. In the days that followed, the world around Texas began to settle back into a rhythm that felt familiar, but never again quite ordinary. The deep freeze had passed, leaving behind memories etched in frost and resilience forged in darkness. And now, slowly, gently, daily routines began to thaw back into place. Morning sunlight, warmer and brighter, filtered through curtains once stiff with cold. People woke not to shivers, but to the soft hum of heaters and the comforting scent of coffee brewing again. The first sip tasted different, richer, grounding, a small symbol of normal life returning. Children prepared for school, gathering backpacks that had sat untouched during the storm. Their voices carried new excitement as they talked about seeing friends, sharing free stories, and stepping out into a world no longer bound by ice. Some buses rumbled back to life, tires splashing through puddles where snow had once towered. Adults resumed their routines with quiet gratitude. The morning commute returned, cars lining up on roads now clear and shimmering with sunlit water. Office lights flickered on, illuminating desks where work had paused mid-task. Shops reopened, shelves slowly restocked, cheerful greetings shared between customers and workers. Grocery stores buzzed softly as people walked through aisles that had once been bare. Fresh produce filled crates again. Milk chilled in refrigerators that now hummed confidently. Bread returned to its shelves in neat rows, the simple sight lifting spirits like a long-awaited sunrise. Neighborhoods echoed with new rhythms, too. Garbage trucks rolled through streets with their familiar mechanical roar. Mail carriers resumed their routes, delivering letters that had been delayed by days of stillness. Construction crews worked steadily, repairing damage with careful hands and steady optimism. And as routines returned, so did small rituals that had been forgotten during the storm. Morning joggers ventured out again, their breath visible but no longer painful in the air. Dogs tugged eagerly at leashes, tails wagging as they rediscovered parks melting back into green. People lingered on porches, warming their faces in the gentle sun, greeting neighbors with smiles that held deeper meaning than before. Yet even as life regained its rhythm, there was a softness in the way people moved, a lingering awareness of how quickly everything had changed, how precious normalcy truly was. Conversations at coffee shops carried warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. How are you holding up? You have water again? Did your pipes get fixed? The freeze had left its mark, but it had also carved new pathways between people. Routines returned, but they did so with a shared sense of gratitude, an understanding that the simplest parts of life were gifts. Texas was healing, homes were healing, hearts were healing, and as routines slowly settled back into place, the state stepped forward, wiser, warmer, and forever changed. As days stretched into a gentler, warmer rhythm, sunlight began revealing a landscape marked by both hardship and endurance. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the world it left behind, quietly, visibly, unmistakably. Morning light now spilled across streets, still stained with thaw lines, tracing the paths where melted ice had carved winding trails toward gutters and drains. Front yards, once sculpted in heavy snow, softened into uneven patches of frost-kissed grass, some green, some brown, all slowly reviving under the touch of returning warmth. Homes bore the marks of the freeze like stories written in wood and stone. A broken fence leaning slightly to one side, a roof missing a few shingles, siding stained in streaks where icicles had melted in sudden warm bursts. Piles of debris, fallen limbs, broken pipes, torn insulation, waiting patiently to be gathered and taken away. Driveways that had once been quiet under winter's weight now filled with the sounds of cleanup. The scrape of shovels clearing leftover slush, the rustle of trash bags being filled, the steady rhythm of brooms sweeping away salt, grit, and the memory of ice. Everywhere people were working. Neighbors who had shared warmth during the storm now shared tools, rakes, saws, wheelbarrows. Someone patched a roof while a friend held the ladder steady. Someone hauled branches to the curb while another helped sweep the street clean. Children collected small twigs and pine cones, carrying them in plastic buckets, as if gathering relics from an adventure they didn't fully understand. The sunlight revealed scars, yes, but it also revealed resilience. Gardens that had been crushed beneath heavy snow now revealed tiny green shoots pushing up through the soil, defying the cold that had pressed down just days before. Birds, robins, sparrows, doves, returned to tree branches bending with early buds, filling the recovering world with gentle song. Even the air smelled different, not icy, not stagnant, but fresh, rich with the scent of thawing earth and sun-warmed wood. In towns and cities, crews continued their work repairing power lines, clearing drainage systems, and assessing damage. Their fluorescent vests shimmered in the sunlight, moving like small beacons of restoration across the landscape. People paused to watch them sometimes, offering bottles of water, words of thanks, or simple nods of gratitude. And in those moments, Texas felt wrapped in a quiet understanding that while the storm had been harsh and unforgiving, the recovery was tender, collective, and filled with human warmth. Sunlight moved slowly across the aftermath, touching the scars without judgment, and illuminating the strength that had carried the state through its darkest freeze. As the sun continued warming the land, and the memory of ice retreated into the corners of shadows, gratitude began to bloom across Texas in ways as gentle and natural as spring's first flowers. It showed itself in small gestures, quiet reflections, sincere words exchanged between people who had walked through the cold together. There was gratitude for warmth itself, a feeling so simple, so ordinary in everyday life, yet so profoundly missed during the darkest days of the freeze. People lingered near heaters, letting the soft, steady air wash over them. They wrapped their hands around warm mugs and let the heat seep into their fingers, closing their eyes to savor the comfort. There was gratitude for running water, clear, steady, reliable. Each time a faucet turned without sputtering, families shared relieved smiles. The sound of a shower, long, silent, felt like a small miracle. Even the washing of dishes became an act of appreciation rather than a chore. There was gratitude for electricity, for lights that flicked on instantly, for stoves that heated food without hesitation, for the gentle hum of appliances signaling the return of normal life. Television screens glowed once again with news and stories. Chargers revived phones long kept cold. Homes glowed warm against the dusk. But above all, there was gratitude for people, for neighbors who had shared their last blanket or their last bottle of water, for volunteers who had stood in freezing winds handing out supplies with tired smiles, for linemen and plumbers and emergency workers who had labored without rest through ice and darkness, for teachers checking on students, friends sending encouragement, families staying close through the cold. Everywhere gratitude flowed like a warm current. On porches, people waved a little longer than before. Inside grocery stores, strangers exchanged knowing nods, soft acknowledgments that they had survived something together. Churches and community centers held small gatherings of thanks, inviting people to share stories of the kindness they experienced. Some families wrote notes and taped them to windows. "Thank you, power crews. Grateful for our neighbors. We made it through." Others delivered homemade cookies or loaves of bread to those who had helped them. The gifts were simple, but the meaning ran deep. In diaries, journals, or quiet thoughts before sleep, people reflected on what they had learned, not just about storms and infrastructure, but about the strength of ordinary kindness. Gratitude, like warmth, had returned. It filled spaces that cold had once claimed. It softened memories that might have otherwise stayed sharp. It reminded everyone that even in the hardest moments, humanity had shone like a lantern in the dark. In the weeks that followed, as the last patches of frost surrendered to the sun and the land sighed beneath warmer skies, a quiet movement swept across Texas, a movement not just to repair what had been broken, but to rebuild with intention, care, and hope. People began stepping into hardware stores again, their lists long but their spirits steady. A roll of insulation, a new pipe fitting, fresh drywall, a bag of nails. These items weren't simply supplies, they were steps toward reclaiming homes, restoring comfort, and closing the cold chapter piece by piece. Inside houses, projects unfolded slowly. Walls that had been cut open to reveal burst pipes were patched with new boards. Floors that had buckled under rushing water were replaced plank by plank. Cabinets damaged by the freeze were scrubbed, sanded, or rebuilt entirely. Windows that had once been white with frost now shone clear again, trimmed with fresh caulk to guard against future cold. Every repair held a quiet sense of triumph. Outside, communities organized volunteer groups, people of all ages showing up with tool belts and work gloves ready to help rebuild the homes of neighbors who needed extra hands. Some repaired roofs, others helped haul debris. A few painted freshly patched walls in colors chosen to symbolize new beginnings. The rhythm of rebuilding created its own kind of music. The gentle scrape of sandpaper smoothing a surface, the thud of lumber being carried into place, the murmur of friends discussing how best to reinforce a wall, the rustle of tarps laid out to protect newly mended floors. In the evenings, families sat together on newly repaired porches or living rooms, still smelling faintly of fresh paint, breathing in the relief of progress. The storm had changed them, not just physically, but emotionally. They had learned their resilience, discovered the strength of their communities, and found hope in the way people came together. And slowly, hope became a structure as real as any home. It rose in neighborhoods where volunteers helped replant gardens crushed by snow. It shimmered in playgrounds where children returned, chasing each other beneath bright blue skies. It echoed in town meetings where people discussed ways to prepare for the future, their voices calm but determined. Rebuilding wasn't just about fixing damage, it was about restoring confidence, restoring peace, restoring the belief that even after the coldest nights, warmth would always return. Texas began to look different, not because the storm had broken it, but because the people were rebuilding it with clearer eyes, stronger hands, and newly awakened hearts. Hope stood everywhere now, quiet, steady, and growing. As life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, the days grew warmer, and the freeze retreated fully into memory. Yet the impact of the storm lingered in small ways, in quiet moments, in stories people found themselves telling when the sun dipped low and the air cooled gently in the evenings. These were memories etched not just in ice, but in the hearts of those who had lived through it. Some remembered the silence, the thick, heavy quiet that blanketed neighborhoods when power had vanished. No humming appliances, no distant traffic. Only the soft crackling of ice and the whisper of wind threading through frozen branches. Others remembered the cold, the way it wrapped around them, seeped through walls, settled into their bones. They remembered the sharp bite of icy air when opening a door, the clouded breath lingering in unheated rooms, the way every blanket and coat became precious armor against the freeze. Many recalled the fear, the uncertainty that came with each passing hour without heat or water, the worry for elderly relatives, the anxiety of dwindling supplies, the nervous hope that text messages would deliver good news, even when battery levels slipped dangerously low. But alongside those heavy memories lived softer ones, memories warmed by human connection. People remembered sharing a single flashlight beam with family around a circle of blankets. They remembered the quiet bravery of a neighbor knocking on their door in the dark, asking if they needed anything. They remembered the taste of hot soup after days of cold food, or nothing at all. They remembered the first flicker of electricity returning, a moment so small yet so powerful it brought tears to their eyes. Some memories made them smile unexpectedly, like the time children pretended their living room was a campsite, glowing with lantern light, or when a neighbor's cat spent 2 nights curled on their lap because both needed the warmth, or the way snow transformed familiar streets into strange, beautiful landscapes that felt both eerie and magical. When people looked back, the freeze didn't feel like a single event. It felt like a series of moments strung together like beads on a cold string. Some beads were heavy, others were shining. All of them were unforgettable. Even now, as warmth settled comfortably over Texas and the world looked ordinary again, people knew those memories would stay with them. They were reminders, reminders of vulnerability, but also of strength, reminders of fear, but also of courage, reminders of isolation, but also of the deep, quiet unity that had carried them through. Though the frost had melted, its imprint remained, etched softly into the stories Texans would tell for generations. As warmth fully returned and the land shed its icy shell, Texas found itself in a period of reflection, an inward-looking moment that stretched from quiet living rooms to bustling city halls, from classrooms to community centers. The storm had left marks on every corner of the state, and now people sought to understand what it meant, not just for themselves, but for the future. Families sat around kitchen tables, sipping coffee in the comfort of restored heat, discussing what they had learned. The conversations were calm, thoughtful. Next time, we'll keep more water stored. We should have extra blankets and batteries ready. We'll check on the neighbors sooner. These simple sentences carried the weight of experience, shaped by nights when warmth was scarce and uncertainty was constant. Communities held meetings, some in person, some online, to talk about what had happened. People shared experiences that were at once personal and universal. One person described watching frost crawl across their walls. Another told of cooking meals on a camping stove. Someone spoke softly about losing a family pet to the cold. Someone else described strangers who saved them with a knock on the door. City leaders, engineers, and planners discussed the storm from another angle, examining failures, studying weaknesses, reflecting on how their state, strong in so many ways, had been brought to its knees by ice. They talked of upgrades, investments, new safeguards. They talked of preparing for the unthinkable, so the unthinkable would not happen again. Teachers asked students to write about their experiences. The children's responses, innocent, honest, were windows into the storm's emotional depth. I slept in the same bed as my parents. I liked when we all stayed in one room together. It was very cold, but my mom said we'd be okay. Our neighbors brought us food. I won't forget that. Even businesses reflected. Hardware stores ordered extra generators and insulation. Grocery stores evaluated emergency plans. Small shops put together lists of supplies to keep on hand for future storms. And in quiet moments, when the sun dipped low and painted long shadows across the ground, people found themselves turning inward, reflecting not just on hardship, but on connection. They thought about the subtle kindness of a shared phone charger, the warmth of a borrowed blanket, the relief of hearing a loved one's voice after hours of silence, the gratitude for every helper who braved the cold. In these reflections, a truth became clear. The freeze had exposed fragility, but it had also revealed unity. It had broken pipes, but strengthened communities. It had darkened homes, but illuminated the resilience of the human spirit. Texas reflected, and in that reflection, it found clarity and hope. As winter loosened its grip completely, and the cold faded into memory, the land began to heal in the most natural way it knew, by turning green again. At first, it happened quietly, almost shyly, as though spring was unsure whether it was truly welcome. But day by day, color seeped back into Texas, painting over the storm's gray scars with gentle strokes of life. Grass that had lain flattened and brown beneath the weight of ice began to rise, stretching thin blades toward the sun. Small patches of green appeared along sidewalks and driveway edges, soft as velvet, delicate as early hope. What the storm had pressed down, warmth now lifted. Trees, too, found their courage. Branches that had once hung stiff and brittle with ice began to bud. Tiny leaves emerged, pinpoints of life against dark limbs, growing steadily, confidently. Even the trees that had lost branches during the freeze stood tall again, resilient silhouettes against a clearing sky. Gardens awakened slowly. Soil softened under the touch of the sun. Flower beds, once hidden beneath snowy blankets, stirred with new life. Bulbs planted long ago began pushing upward, daffodils, tulips, crocuses, each bright bloom a soft, cheerful declaration that winter's chapter had closed. People noticed the change with quiet wonder. On morning walks, they paused beside tiny green sprouts, smiling at these shy signs of revival. Children knelt to examine new leaves, their fingers brushing the cool, damp earth. Gardeners returned to their yards with gloves and watering cans, pulling away dead twigs and planting new seeds with careful hands. Spring birds returned in colorful gatherings, cardinals with bright red feathers, blue jays flashing sapphire wings, mockingbirds singing confidently from telephone lines. Their songs drifted through open windows, filling homes with notes that felt like promises. Even the air changed. It carried the scent of thawed soil, new growth, and gentle warmth. It moved softly through open doors. It wrapped around people like a fresh beginning. The freeze had been harsh. It had stripped the land bare, pressing an icy stillness into every corner. But the return of green reminded everyone that nature, like people, could endure more than they imagined. New life didn't erase the past, but it softened it. It brought balance. It brought renewal. And as Texas watched the world bloom around it, hearts felt lighter. Breathing felt easier. The land, once silent beneath the weight of winter, now whispered a single tender truth. We grow again. As warmth settled fully across Texas and life moved onward with its familiar rhythms, one question began echoing quietly through homes, communities, and halls of leadership. How do we make sure this never happens again? It wasn't asked with fear, but with clarity. Born from nights spent in darkness, cold, and uncertainty. Now that the freeze had passed, Texans turned their thoughts toward the future with steady resolve. In living rooms, families created small emergency plans. A drawer was dedicated to flashlights and extra batteries. 2 or 3 blankets stayed folded in an easy-to-reach spot. Bottled water lined a shelf in the pantry, just in case. A small portable stove found a home in the garage. These weren't signs of worry, they were signs of wisdom, woven gently into everyday life. Neighborhood groups, once formed for survival, remained connected. They traded advice on insulation, shared numbers for reliable repair crews, and discussed setting up communication chains for future emergencies. Some communities invested in shared resources, generators, water filters, portable heaters, so no one would face a storm alone again. Schools and teachers guided students through activities about preparedness, helping them understand how to stay safe, how to check on others, and how to stay calm during unexpected events. Children embraced the lessons with open minds, their resilience shining in the way they asked thoughtful questions and shared their own memories. City councils and state officials gathered in meeting rooms, reviewing data, identifying vulnerabilities, and making plans to strengthen infrastructure. Engineers proposed upgrades, specialists offered solutions, residents attended public meetings, sharing their experiences with voices steady but passionate. Power companies evaluated grids, pipelines, and fail-safes. Municipalities discussed weatherization. Communities advocated for changes that would protect the most vulnerable. The conversation wasn't about blame. It was about responsibility, about growth, about honoring the hardship of the storm by building a better path forward. At hardware stores, aisles of insulation, pipe covers, and emergency supplies became more familiar to shoppers who once walked past them without a second glance. People learned how to protect their homes more effectively, how to winterize pipes, and prepare for cold snaps that once felt impossible in the Texas climate. And through it all, a collective mindset emerged. Preparedness was not fear. Preparedness was hope. Hope shaped into action. The storm had taught Texas that the future could be unpredictable, but it had also shown that resilience grows strongest when people learn, adapt, and prepare together. With every plan made, every conversation held, every improvement begun, the state moved one step closer to a future where even the harshest storm could not dim its spirit. In the months after the freeze, something subtle but powerful unfolded across Texas, not just a return to normal life, but a quiet strengthening. It grew slowly, like roots beneath thawed soil, steady and unseen at first. But everywhere you looked, signs of a stronger tomorrow began to appear. Homes once damaged by ice now stood repaired, fortified with new insulation, updated pipes, and reinforced walls. What had broken was rebuilt, not just to restore what was lost, but to withstand what might come again. The repairs were not simply fixes, they were promises. Communities, too, held onto the bonds forged through hardship. Neighborhood groups stayed active, sharing alerts when weather changed, exchanging advice, checking in on each other with text like, "You good over there? Need anything? I've got extra supplies if you're short." These habits lingered, becoming part of the new fabric of daily life. Quiet gestures that made people feel safer, supported, connected. Local businesses that had struggled during the storm reopened with determination. They restocked shelves, repaired broken pipes, and offered gratitude to the loyal customers who returned. Many small shops kept emergency kits behind their counters now, flashlights, blankets, bottled water, because the memory of need had shaped a new sense of preparedness. Across cities and towns, new initiatives took root. Emergency response systems improved. Weatherization projects expanded. Power infrastructure strengthened under new regulations. Meetings that were once filled with urgency became conversations of progress, updates on grid improvements, timelines for upgrades, plans for resilience that stretched far into the future. Even nature reflected this renewed strength. Gardens that had been crushed by snow now flourished with vibrant blooms. Trees once bowed by ice now stood taller, branches full and green. Wildlife returned. Birds, deer, small animals, moving through parks that had healed along with the people. But perhaps the greatest change of all was internal. People carried a different kind of confidence now. They had faced something rare, something intense, and they had endured. A mother who once feared the cold nights now stored extra supplies with calm certainty. An elderly neighbor who had weathered the freeze alone now had a list of phone numbers taped neatly to the wall, neighbors who promised to check on him. Families who once hardly knew the people living around them now shared meals, memories, and quiet plans for the future. Resilience had taken root in countless small ways. The storm had revealed vulnerabilities, yes, but it had also revealed courage, strength, compassion, community. Texas stood not just restored but renewed, shaped by hardship, strengthened by unity, and ready to face tomorrow with deeper wisdom and warmer hearts. As time passed and the deep freeze became a story told rather than a moment lived, Texas found comfort in remembering together. The storm was no longer a source of fear. It had become a shared chapter, a piece of history woven into the identity of communities across the state. People remembered it in gentle ways. Families told the story at dinner tables, recounting how they bundled together in one room, sharing body heat and whispered reassurances. Parents described melting snow to make pasta, lighting candles to read stories, and huddling close as the house grew colder. Children, now older, looked back with the wide-eyed awe of realizing how strong their families had been. Neighbors recalled the knocks at their doors, offers of firewood, blankets, and warm food delivered with quiet care. They remembered checking on each other through the coldest nights, sharing resources, and finding comfort in the simple presence of another person nearby. In schools, students wrote essays about their experiences. Some wrote about sleeping in coats and gloves. Others wrote about volunteering at shelters, helping distribute water, or comforting younger siblings who didn't understand why the lights wouldn't turn on. These stories, read aloud in classrooms, brought students closer, reminding them that they had lived through something extraordinary together. Communities held small remembrance gatherings in parks or community centers. People lit candles, not out of necessity this time, but in tribute to those who had helped, those who had endured, and those who had been lost. The flickering flames created a soft glow against the evening sky, symbolizing warmth after darkness. Local libraries curated displays of photos, news clippings, and handwritten notes collected during the freeze. Visitors walked slowly through the exhibits, seeing images of snow-covered streets, volunteers bundled in layers, emergency crews battling the cold. Each piece told a story, not only of struggle, but of solidarity. Even years later, the freeze lived on in conversations sparked by the slightest chill in the air. "Remember when?" someone would say, and the stories would flow easily. "Remember how the power came back at midnight? Remember that pot of soup we shared? Remember how beautiful the snow was, even though it was so cold?" The remembering wasn't heavy anymore. It was healing. It brought warmth instead of fear, connection instead of loneliness, perspective instead of panic. Because Texas didn't remember the freeze as a time of isolation. It remembered it as a time when strangers became friends, communities grew stronger, and resilience shone like light through the coldest night. And every time those memories were shared, the warmth of human connection returned, slow, soft, steady, just like the thaw that had once saved the state from the grip of winter. As the years passed and the winter of 2021 settled into the long memory of Texas, the deep freeze became more than an event. It became a legacy, a quiet, enduring reminder of what people had faced, what they had lost, and what they had found within themselves and each other. It lived in stories shared by families on porches as the evening breeze cooled the summer air. It surfaced in conversations between neighbors who had once kept each other warm with blankets, hot meals, and simple companionship. It lingered in the careful preparations everyone now made when the weather turned cold, a small nod to a time when cold had meant more than shivers. And yet the legacy was not one of despair. It was a legacy of resilience. Texas remembered how it had united, how it had stood strong in the face of unimaginable cold. People remembered the way communities had formed overnight, how strangers had become protectors and friends, how every gesture of kindness, big or small, had been a lifeline. The freeze also left a legacy of change. Infrastructure improved, power systems strengthened, emergency plans rewritten with clarity and purpose, communities more connected and aware of one another's needs. These changes weren't loud or dramatic. They were steady, thoughtful, and rooted in the understanding that the storm had revealed where strength was needed most. In classrooms, children learned about the freeze as a piece of history, one their families had lived through and survived together. Teachers told them how Texans helped Texans, how courage often looked like carrying water through the snow or knocking on a neighbor's door in the dark. In libraries, documentaries, and books captured the memories of those days so they would never be lost. Records of the freeze weren't just statistics. They were stories of real people with real warmth in the cold. And in quiet moments when winter returned each year with gentler hands, people remembered, not with fear, but with reverence. They remembered the frozen roads, the silent nights, the candles flickering in the dark, the long lines for water, the first warm breeze signaling the storm's retreat, the relief when lights returned, the gratitude that followed. Most of all, they remembered the human connections, threaded through every moment like golden warmth woven into icy fabric. The legacy of the freeze was not the cold, it was the warmth that survived it. Even as Texas healed, rebuilt, and moved forward, something subtle yet profound settled into the spirit of the state, a quiet strength, shaped by cold days and colder nights, polished by endurance, and held together by the warmth of human connection. It didn't make itself known in loud declarations or grand gestures. It showed itself in gentle ways. A mother who kept extra blankets folded neatly at the foot of the bed. A father who checked the weather twice when winter clouds gathered. A child who remembered how brave they had been when the lights went out and the house fell silent. A neighbor who instinctively looked out their window when the temperature dropped, scanning for anyone who might need help. The storm had changed people, but it had changed them softly. Where there had once been assumptions of comfort, there was now gratitude. Where there had once been separation, there was now community. Where there had once been vulnerability, there was now resilience. Texas went about its days with that quiet strength woven into everything, into every repaired pipe, every strengthened power line, every emergency plan taped to the inside of a cabinet door. People moved through life with a deeper sense of awareness, a sharper understanding of what truly mattered. In parks, families enjoyed warm days with a little more appreciation for the sunshine. In homes, heaters hummed their steady song, no longer taken for granted. In conversations, the freeze appeared not as a burden, but as a shared memory that bound communities together. And even when winter returned, bringing its chill and its uncertainty, the state remained calm. People prepared early, checked on each other often, and faced the cold with the knowledge that they had already endured the worst and had done so together. That quiet strength lived in every thoughtful gesture, every neighborly act, every warm smile exchanged on brisk mornings. It was not loud. It was not boastful. It was steady, like the heartbeat of a people who had walked through ice and come out stronger. The freeze had once brought an entire state to its knees, but in the end, it had also taught that strength is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it is gentle. Sometimes it is shared. Sometimes it is simply the will to carry on with kindness. As time continued its gentle march forward, the freeze of 2021 softened further into memory. What had once been a moment of collective hardship became, slowly and tenderly, a chapter that people look back on with clarity, gratitude, and a quiet sense of triumph. The final thaw was not a single day, nor a moment marked on any calendar. It was a feeling, a soft loosening inside the heart. It arrived on warm spring afternoons when the sun settled gently over rooftops, turning the world gold. It arrived in the hum of air conditioners preparing for summer, a familiar sound that reminded people how far they had come. It arrived in gardens blooming fully again, bright reds, soft yellows, deep purples bursting from soil that had once been frozen solid. The final thaw lived in the way people told their stories now, no longer weighed down by fear or uncertainty, but carried with wisdom and compassion. Parents shared the tale with their children, not to frighten them, but to show them how strong they had been. Grandparents recounted the experience with quiet pride, remembering the cold and the kindness in equal measure. Neighbors who had once been strangers now waved with warmth, their bond lingering like the afterglow of a shared journey. The land itself reflected the thaw. Rivers that had frozen at their edges now flowed clear and confident. Trees stood tall, with full crowns of leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Grasslands shimmered with life beneath wide Texas skies. And in that restored world, the freeze shifted from a wound to a memory, from a challenge to a testament, from a moment of darkness to a story of light. People carried the lessons forward, not with worry, but with readiness. They stocked emergency kits, they insulated pipes, they checked on one another at the first hint of cold. But they also carried forward the warmth that had carried them through the storm, the warmth of community, of kindness, of shared humanity. In the final thaw, Texas understood that while winter might come again, the heart of its people would always burn brighter. Thank you, dear listener, for journeying with me through this long, quietly powerful story of the Texas deep freeze. the 2021 winter collapse that left millions in the dark. As the narrative settles and the warmth of the present returns, I invite you to rest deeply, knowing that even in the coldest histories, humanity shines with soft, unwavering light. If you've made it this far, I hope the gentle pacing, the vivid details, and the warmth woven through the hardship have brought you calm, comfort, and peace. And whether you listened from the U.S. in the late night hours, from Europe in the early morning, from Canada wrapped in your own winter, or from anywhere else in the world, your presence here means so much. Before you drift into sleep, I encourage you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, what time it is for you, and how this story carried you through the quiet moments of your evening. Now, let your eyes grow heavy, let your breath slow. Let the softness of night cradle you gently, and as you slip into rest, remember the lesson carried through the freeze and the thaw, that warmth always returns, that hope endures, and that even in the darkest storms, you are never truly alone. Good night, friend. Sleep peacefully.